the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
All right, welcome Sublation media viewers, all you crazy sublated commies out there. It's I, Douglas Lain, author of Wave of Mutilation, the short story, The Last Apollo Mission, and many other things. With me today, as always, is Benjamin Studebaker.
Yep, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge, and author of 2 books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
All right, so Ben, I'm going to ask you to be patient with me again this week as I have written up kind of an essay, at least some notes about the question of regression and in politics and in culture. Last week, I spoke to Chris Catrone on the Catrone Zone, and after that podcast, and especially the Parrot Room podcast, I was led to read Adorno's 1962 essay entitled Commitment. It's an essay that takes up the question of political commitment in literature. It was written in response not only to Jean-Paul Sartre, whose What is Literature argued that a writer cannot write for the future or write for the past, but has to engage with society in the present, taking up social and political struggles of his time, but also just to the general question of politics and art that had been raging in the 50s and early 60s. He was being critical of Sartre and Bertolt Brecht as well. Bertolt Brecht's theater of alienation, or his didactic approach to the stage, had, according to Adorno, ended as a failure. So this essay, Commitment, is dense and it makes several arguments. But the primary point of the essay was this: by remaining committed to a political project that had been disrupted and disoriented, by pretending to be in the position to fully and adequately judge society and prescribe an action or method for change, both Brecht and Sartre had fallen into falsity and fantasy. Instead, purely pessimistic works such as those written by Kafka or Beckett were stronger, arriving at something more true and resilient than their more self-consciously radical Marxist contemporaries had managed to create. So I'm going to go on. I have a bit to say about all this, but are you familiar with Adorno's theory of regression and maybe this particular essay? Have you read it?
Yeah, I'm very excited to talk about Adorno and regression. Great topic. I'm super excited to hear what you think about it.
Okay, well, my interpretation of Adorno's critique, and particularly in this essay, is this: that Brecht's work in particular abandons the reality principle. In Freud's framework, the reality principle is a psychological function that governs the ego as it mediates the demands from the id. So in Brecht's case, the demand is, in some sense, not antisocial or against civilization, as it normally is, but in some ways it's justified. He wants to overturn capitalist relations in favor of a new society mediated and operating with the aim of self-consciously and or autonomously meeting human needs and desires. However, Adorno says Brecht cheats by forcing his rural and uneducated characters to work out the ideas that reflect and exhibit Brecht's refinement in their own vernacular. He creates unrealistic situations in his works. And Adorno says that these works were marred by the theatricality of total plain-spokenness, what his classical predecessors once denounced as the idiocy of rural life. Brecht, like some existential ontologists, treats these as ancient truths. His whole oeuvre is a Sisyphean labor to reconcile his highly cultivated and subtle taste with the crudely heteronymous demands which he desperately imposed on himself. Worse, the self-consciousness and lack of entertainment value in Brecht's didactic plays, the alienation effect that he mastered, became, according to Adorno, a cliched and deadening device, or as Adorno himself wrote, the primacy of lesson over form, which Brecht intended to achieve, became in reality a formal device itself. The suspension of form turns back against its own character as appearance. So I'm only half educated on Brecht. Like, I haven't seen the Threepenny Opera or any of his works. I just have read about the theory behind Brecht. I only know the secondary literature. But I think that I'm still qualified to make a judgment of the theory. So I wouldn't want to pass judgment on Brecht himself. I wouldn't want to particularize the problem that Adorno is talking about here either. The point is not whether Brecht is a great artist or not, but rather the point is to understand how missteps and falsity, how the abandonment of the reality principle can lead to a regression. So I want to take an example of a regression from Brecht. The song "The Ballad of Mac the Knife" is the example. It's from the Threepenny Opera, which was a reworking of John Gay's 18th century Beggar's Opera. Both works were satires or critical evaluations of society's poverty and criminality. Most reviewers of the Threepenny Opera can easily grasp what the play is about. The consensus is clear. It is about the corruption and hypocrisy of the creme de la creme, the people who are supposed to be better and know better. It is about how the criminal class and the upper class are indistinguishable from one another, one and the same. So the song "Mac the Knife" lays out the story of a brutal gangster named Mac who, in the story of the play, seduces and corrupts the daughter of an upper-class family. The story of the play is about how the family's attempts to stop Mac and protect their social reputation and fortune are thwarted by Mac's ability to use his connections, his associations with the powerful, and in this way, the play exposes society's corruption. So Mac uses his ability to connect with powerful people to protect himself, and triumphs in the end. And along the way, the upper class family debases themselves. In Germany at the time, Mac the Knife was the most successful aspect of the play. It became a standard in nightclubs and bars. It was covered by many German singers. But it was when it hit America, when an off-Broadway version of the opera in English became a hit, that Mac the Knife became sanitized and really started to regress at a quite a clip. So the play sanitized the lyrics of the song. Here are a few lines of the original lyrics as translated literally into English. "And the great fire in Soho, 7 children dead at once. In the crowd stands Mackie Messer. He's not asked and doesn't know. And the child bride in her nightie, whose name has been forgotten, wakes to find Mackie Messer slipping softly from her bed." And I want to show, like, run a clip so people know what the song sounds like in German. Here's the original.
Und der Haifisch, der hat Zähne und die trägt im Gesicht. Und Mackie, der hat ein Messer, doch das Messer sieht man nicht.
So, you could dance to it, I suppose, but it isn't a happy-go-lucky song, I don't think. But the Americanized version of the song became, well, it changed the meaning of the song, I think. It excises the horror of the song, and it became a jazz standard as well, most notably and successfully by the crooner Bobby Darin, who made it his signature number in 1958 and who landed, I think, a permanent gig in Las Vegas due to his version's popularity. And I want to run a clip from that.
On the sidewalk, ooh, Sunday morning, lives up by day, just oozing life. Hey, someone's sneaking round the corner. Could that someone be Mac the Knife?
So that's Bobby Darin. By the way, that's my favorite version of the song. Like I feel like I am regressed myself. Like I truly love that version of the song. And I can't explain it or defend it exactly. But it didn't stop there. This became picked up by the McDonald's Corporation in the 80s because of the song's association with Vegas, its incorporation into the Rat Pack aesthetic and industry. The successful importation of Brecht's leftist critique of capitalism had been turned completely against itself, or was in the 80s, rather than exposing the rotten violence inherent to capitalist business practices, rather than stripping away the layer of respectability and civilization that hides the brutality in our society. The song accomplished what Roderick calls psychoanalysis in reverse. It became what it was critiquing, a way to maintain innocence even as it celebrated brutality, lulling the audience into a form of non-listening. People can hear Darin's version of the song hundreds of times without ever understanding what the song's about. The violence of the number was secreted away, well, this is what was the result.
When the clock strikes 6:30, babe, time to head for Golden Lights. Hey, it's a good time for the great taste dinner at McDonald's. It's Mac tonight. Come on, make it Mac tonight.
So this was released in the Reagan era. It was created in an effort to expand the McDonald's brand and turn what had been a family restaurant frequented during road trips, on birthdays, or as a guilty pleasure and welcome relief from the drudgery of preparing a home-cooked meal into a cool locale for an adult population that wanted to enjoy an ersatz nightlife. The violence of the song is, of course, mostly vanished. Even though the Moon Man character is sort of alien and kind of a monstrosity. If you look at him, he might have some dirty secret somewhere. And in fact, by 2007, the Moon Man has been transformed again. Now excised from the song, he's picked up by 4chan trolls on the alt-right and made to spout literal Nazi propaganda. So here,
I'm Moon Man, representing white power. I stack bodies higher than Trump Tower. Control the news, control the planet. Fascism is back, and the left can't stand it. Death camps for the blacks, sit back and relax. Right-wing death squads prepare to attack.
So you can see that the critique of capitalism has now been totally debased, subverted, reversed, turned around into its opposite. And the original false note may be part of what set that off. We can't just blame the culture industry as something objective, but rather it's a way in which the critique went wrong. The irresponsibility of the original moment that set up the terms for this regression. I think that's my claim. What do you make of that, Benjamin?
Yeah, anytime that we're talking about regression, we tend to be talking about the severing of something, taking something out of its context, taking something out of its complete situation, and deploying it in some other way, so that when you experience it, you think you're getting that whole thing, but you're only getting some small slice or specific part of it. And this can be as little as you listen to music on a recording, and therefore you are not there for when the music is produced. You're not there for when it's composed. You're not there for when it's performed. You don't have a connection to the performance or the composition or the original recording. You just get the sound. And then, of course, you can take this further and break the sound down into component parts and emphasize particular parts. And memes do this. They take some specific image or some specific part of something, rip it out of the context, deploy it in some other context, and all you get is some little slice of the original thing. So the whole creative process becomes opaque to you. You're experiencing just this small little bit. And because the small little bit still has some sort of technical appeal, it can come to carry a lot of different things from what it would have carried in the original context in which it was first deployed. So there's an invitation to you, because you like the particular thing in isolation, to adopt whatever else it's packaged with and to forget where it comes from or the whole context of its meaning.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think you're entirely wrong. I think that's one side of the question, but I can't help but think about Walter Benjamin's opinion of movies, of film, and his embrace of the collage as a potentially radical form of art. And he saw films as collage ultimately, because they did take images out of their original context and edit them, slice them up, and put them together to create fictional space sometimes, but also to set up the images and juxtapositions to each other to generate new meanings out of them. And he even went so far, if I'm remembering his essay correctly, to claim that the fact that audiences are not called upon to literally read the screen, but rather are kind of pushed into a slightly more unconscious state, a more passive state, and a more distracted state, that there's some way in which that creates the distance necessary for critique and reevaluation to emerge, for self-reflection to emerge.
I think we can see a lot of the same kinds of tendencies in film. A lot of films, especially in the last 40 years or so, have a lot of callbacks to earlier films, where the audience will not be expected to really be familiar with the whole history of film, but might have some fleeting memory or association with something in particular, some reference that's made to some other work. So works become populated with references. Those references are taken out of the films in which they originally occurred. They're given some kind of new, partial, or different meaning in more contemporary films, and commodified in that way, used to sell some new film that has a different purpose altogether.
Yeah. No. Okay. So that's not quite the same thing as what you first said, because the other thing is I was recalling Benjamin's celebration of the death of the aura in art, right? So the idea that an artwork had to be in a particular space, grounded in a particular ritual, cut off from the rest of society, that its value had to do with this originality, not just in terms of thought or like creativity, but it's the fact that it was specific. And that, that he thought that the aura being overcome again was liberatory. But what you're describing though is how I think it's something more along the lines of what Adorno would describe, is how rather than creating works that have their own totality and meaning, we substitute that for kind of semblance of meaning and effect by reproducing the same moves, the same genres, the same songs, maybe even with slight variations, flourishes to individualize them. I mean, these with jazz, the fact that there are these standards, right, that people repeat, like Mac the Knife again and again, demonstrate that the case that you'll be offered the same thing again, but with just slight individual flourishes here and there.
Yeah, on the one hand, jazz promises you that the jazz musicians will be able to improvise and they'll be able to create on the fly. There's this narrative about jazz as a very creative thing. But then in practice, if you look at the music, it tends to be very repetitive and it tends to have a lot of the same moves in it. In point of fact, what is saleable as jazz is not something which is improvised and in which the freedom of the artist can be expressed, but is actually something quite narrow, quite specific, and which tends to become more narrow, more specific, more rigid over time.
Yeah. I'm going to upload this clip that I wasn't planning on necessarily showing, but I will now to illustrate the point. By the way, it's Ella Fitzgerald, who I think is great. Okay. But nonetheless, she's singing Mac the Knife, and she's even commenting on the way in which she is the whole version of this song is sort of a commentary or parody of the way jazz musicians use individual flourishes to really deliver the same thing. Here she is.
Bobby Darin and Louis Armstrong, they made a record. Ooh, what a record of this song. And now Ella and her fellas, we're making a record. What a record, such a record, it's same old song.
So she calls her version a wreck. She says, we're making a wreck of this same old song. So yeah, there is a way in which the artists, tried to struggle against the conformity that the industry would impose upon them. And I think musicians like Ella Fitzgerald did a fairly good job at that. And they're also such a raw talent, but
yeah, and there's an emphasis on how this has come to work differently in their period from how it would have worked 100 or 200 years ago. So when you are taking stuff which was previously reserved only to an elite and you are making it something that people can actually participate in, and indeed ordinary people can contribute to, develop, and further in various ways, where there's an actual relation between what was formerly the high art and the public, that is emancipatory. But when that relationship is broken down and a severance has taken place between high and low culture, then all you have is an ersatz of this, which pretends to still be it, but which isn't actually it. So in the case of the 50s, you have these incredibly talented artists who are still able, from a talent perspective, to produce extremely good work. However, they are caught in what is increasingly a binary in which they either have to produce work that is esoteric and inaccessible to the public, or they have to produce work which is commodity fetishism, which is a commodity production for a public that's getting an ersatz of high culture rather than the thing. And they increasingly are stuck between these options. They can be obscure and make stuff that only a very, very narrow slices of the public listen to, or they can be well-known, popular, and successful, but then they have to make stuff which is increasingly fetishized. And they're stuck in this, and ultimately the space for navigating it becomes narrower and narrower in any particular field of artistic production over time.
yeah, but in the essay Commitment, Adorno takes up 4 different artists, right? Sartre, Brecht, Kafka, and Beckett. And of those, I would say they could all be accused by some of being rarefied, avant-garde, inaccessible. Although I don't believe that really holds if you actually experience the work. I mean, I've read No Exit. I haven't seen it performed, but I've read the play. I've read quite a lot of Kafka. I've experienced the performances of Beckett because he even made films. And while they don't provide the exact same sorts of pleasures as, let's say, a Disney movie like Snow White, or even a film that was aimed at adults like Arthur. I'm going to just keep using old references, but or like this new movie called Sinners. They don't quite deliver on the formula the way these other works do. They nonetheless are accessible. They do provide narratives, which the characters, a way into the work. They don't fall into pure abstraction. And even abstract work can be very accessible when it's art for art's sake and becomes decorative. So it's not a question of necessarily of how accessible it is to the masses, but rather I think it has to do with how well it can accommodate itself to society as it is, to the capitalist mode of the industrial production of culture.
I think
and
part of why Adorno focuses on these specific people is that this is a point in the process of regression that would be denied by most people. Most people would be inclined to view artists like Brecht as not regressed, as examples of a good mixture of culture. Right. So, Mac the Knife, this is an attempt to discuss the situation of the poor, the criminal class in relation to the rich. And it's doing it with seemingly all of the accoutrements of high European modern culture. But for Adorno, there's already in that play the beginning of a process, which will ultimately result in what we see at the end of that series of iterations of Mac the Knife. And so the reason he emphasizes criticizing somebody like Brecht is that it would be too easy. And also, the process had not yet gone far enough for you to get the most egregious examples at the point Adorno was alive. But what is really intellectually difficult for people is to take the criticism at its earliest stages, to say, here is the beginning of something which will get you that. Because for us, stuff that's from the 50s that was considered high culture in the 50s, we are even less able to really evaluate that because it's in a style which is already anachronistic to us. So for us to even have any knowledge of the culture of the 50s is somewhat rarefied, any real serious knowledge in any kind of detailed way of it. So we have a difficult time understanding how somebody could take what has been presented to us as the high examples of a culture, which maybe has fallen off since the 50s, as themselves the beginning of a falling off relative to something before. Hard for us to enter into that headspace. But I think that's why the example of Brecht, because if you can make this argument stick with Brecht, if you can make it stick with Bobby Darin, if you can make it stick with these people, then of course, the later examples, it becomes very obvious. But the tendency will be for people to accept Adorno's argument when it's applied to stuff that's contemporary or that's newer or that came along when they were an adult, but to be resistant to the things that were already around when they were children or which were around 10 or 20 years before.
I mean, I think it's fairly easy to see how it applies to Bobby Darin. I don't see that. I mean, he actually goes eek, like he's looking at a dead mouse when he's describing the dead body on the beach, that in the original the throat had been slashed. I mean, the other way to go, which we did go, in a way, in the 70s and 80s, was to just pornographically exhibit the worst brutality in movies like, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and things like that, which is no better than going eek, I think. But
yeah. But the only way you can indict Bobby Darin for that eek is if you know the original Brecht, if you know it, or at least you've had it described to you.
Right.
If Bobby Darin is the earliest iteration of that you know of, and for many people that will be the case. They might not even know Bobby Darin. They may have heard it. They may have heard some part of that song, but they wouldn't even know that it's Bobby Darin, let alone that Bobby Darin is doing Brecht. So for those people, the possibility that Bobby Darin is itself regressed from something else is not a thinkable thought because there isn't enough of the context that would be necessary. And this is the sense in which I think it's very critical to emphasize that some kind of severance has happened. that the work has
Right.
been cut off from its original context, because it's only because you don't have the original context that it's possible to take up the Bobby Darin as this is a genius piece of work. And the Bobby Darin does appear to be a genius piece of work from the point of view of what comes after Bobby Darin.
Right. And like I said, despite knowing that it's a regression, I quite enjoy it anyhow. And I just try to live with that, fact.
Because it's the culture of the 50s. It's a culture that was around when you were very young and could not have evaluated it in those terms. When you first heard Mac the Knife, you could not have heard the Brecht. It would not have been what you would have been exposed to. It was part of mass culture. So when you were first introduced to it, it was in the framework of the Bobby Darin. So therefore, on some fundamental level, you're not going to react to the Bobby Darin as this is a regressed, partial one-sided ripoff of the Brecht. You can't possibly react to that on a deep emotional little child level. You can intellectualize about that later on, but it's not the same thing.
Mm-hmm. I want to point out that, having been born in late 70 and, almost 71, I did not encounter Bobby Darin when he was on Ed Sullivan. That was not my experience. So the other
Did
thing
they play
about
him on the radio when you were kids still?
I don't recall that. I think, it was like, I was listening to The Fifth Dimension or, some, I don't know, like John Denver. But the Bobby Darin, like I would have encountered Bobby Darin in the 90s alongside, I probably heard the Bobby Darin some other time than that, but in the 90s, I took a class called Jazz and Existentialism. And I listened to Thelonious Monk and Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday and a number of other jazz musicians, bebop jazz. And I would hear Bobby Darin in that context of the bebop. And I would think of it as not as authentic or as interesting as like Thelonious Monk, but nonetheless still partaking of that whole era. And so I have a soft spot for it for that reason.
In my own case, I would have heard it as a kid in some, mass media context, probably on TV or something, or some reference to it on TV out of context. So I would vaguely recognize the sound of it, but wouldn't know anything about where it comes from until a much later point in life. And I think that's how a lot of this stuff ultimately is received. You encounter it in the background, incidentally, in some context where it doesn't really matter which song it was. It could have been any song, really, because its purpose was to sell something or to make something seem cool. And so by the time you know what it is to the point where you could criticize it, you have all sorts of strange emotional associations with it that comes from having heard it in this disjointed, disconnected way.
Well, this style of music is, I think, featured in gangster movies like Goodfellas. I don't know if Goodfellas. I don't think it's in this particular song is in that movie, but there is a way in which the whole Rat Pack aesthetic has been repackaged and presented to the next generations, to younger audiences through gangster movies. So that is probably how we first encountered it.
Yeah, all because of the association of Sinatra with the mob, which may or may not have been accurate.
Right, but but Mac the Knife is about a gangster, literally.
That's true.
So it's a good fit with the Rat Pack for that.
Right. And yet when you watch an 80s gangster movie and it contains some reference to Mac the Knife, you're not going to get the themes or the meaning of the original Brecht play in those 80s gangster movies. Even 80s gangster movies that are considered classic movies today, that people think of as very, very good, high artistic movies, auteur cinema, they're not going to communicate anything like what the Brecht would have communicated. let alone the critique of the Brecht.
Right. Well, I mean, to go back to the Moon Man, alt-right, 4chan meme, their first encounter with Mac the Knife and the Brecht was through the McDonald's ad, right? So, and in a weird way, their embrace of Nazi violence in the Moon Man meme is like a return of the repressed, because that was what was being presented and evaluated and condemned in the Three Penny Opera in Weimar Germany, in anticipation before the Nazis rose to power.
And the incredible thing is that the Nazi imagery, Nazi aesthetics itself has taken on this role of being the commodified thing in regression. Mm-hmm. So when they take up Nazi aesthetics, they are not really interfacing with the context of the 30s in Germany. They're not really grasping the meaningfulness of things Nazis said and did in the context in which they said and did those things. They're ripping those things out of time and selling them as a kind of ersatz revolt, some sort of
right.
individuality. You can be different. And in many regards, it's not dissimilar to the ways in which communist culture is sold to the kids in packaged form with the Che Guevara posters and so on. Mm-hmm. Rip the thing out of context, turn it into aesthetic to make you seem cool or like an individual because you have some familiarity with it, or you're able to identify with or like something that other people condemn. It's the same thing, really.
And that gesture was actually the crazily the gesture of taking up Nazi imagery as a form of rebellion against society was, in my mind, it was done. I mean, of course, it was done by the Nazis, but later on, in towards the latter half of the 20th century, the punk rock scene had many instances where they would take up swastikas and things. And the artists that did that were not actual Nazis or even right wing. It was actually a grasping after a way to still rebel in the 70s after the New Left, after the hippies had come along and then been liquidated into the everyday functioning of society. So there was this, to really go to be extreme, you'd play electric guitar badly and have a swastika on your arm, something like that. So yeah, it certainly has. It is true that taking things out of their original context is a way to expedite the regression, but the technique of collage, of recontextualizing elements, need not actually sever the element from its original context completely.
Yeah, if there's reason, if there's some purpose, real purpose that's driving the construction of the collage, mm-hmm. as opposed to grabbing references from earlier works, shoving them into your new thing so that your characters can drop enough obscure references to things from the past, and then people in the audience who vaguely remember or hear or recognize these references think of themselves as cooler in the know because they vaguely remember, hear, or recognize them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a possibility of doing this in a way which would not be regressed. You can, of course, take things from the past and repurpose them in some vital artistic way, but that's not what's happening. What's happening is an ersatz of that mediated by the commodity form.
Right. So the question, though, I think remains from commitment, which is it possible to create art or even just to write and think in a way, to express your thought in a way that isn't going to be completely subsumed by the totality of capitalist relations in the commodity form, which does its destructive work on our reason and our imagination, because that's what we're really witnessing. is that process, and it's being done to great talents, people with real imaginations, and who are actual creatives. I mean, even that
Yeah.
word is such a debased term. But can we do this? And I think again he points to Kafka and Beckett as examples of how you might survive and persist without risking such serious regression.
It's become a lot harder. And part of the effect of it becoming a lot harder is that you will have on the one side people who are able to create because they're in some way protected from or estranged from social relations, so therefore out of touch with society. And then people who can only create through the relations of production, so through the industry, and therefore who will tend to make commodified and fetishized stuff. And that the trouble is that the space for something which would touch society, but which would not be bound by commodity production, that mediating space closes up. And not only does it close up, but people offer you fake iterations of it so as to persuade you that it's still open when in fact it's shut. And that's where I think this stuff gets really nasty, where it is giving you an impression that it's possible for you to create, and as a consequence of your and millennials have this problem, because millennials were told in the 90s, just follow your dreams and do what you love, and you'll be able to be successful while at the same time doing that. So a lot of millennials went into the arts, went into the humanities, went into academia, trying to have it both ways, and thinking because they were told that they could and would. But what ultimately happens is that the people who are able to make stuff that is not about sales make things that don't have great social purchase, don't speak to social reality. And then the people who make stuff which seems as if it would speak to social reality is just instrumental and commodified.
Well, I'm asking Grok how many copies of The Trial by Kafka have sold. And I'm also remembering a work like The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe, which is hardly Kafka, but nonetheless, I don't think is regressed, or it's not a regression of something. I don't think. Although maybe I should reevaluate that. I shouldn't be so quick to affirm. But Kafka's The Trial sold over 25 million copies and been translated into 65 languages. It was made into a movie by Orson Welles. It managed to be reproduced by society without conforming to or affirming society. Just as an example. I know that's an old example, but what do you make of that?
Well, this would be the question. So at the beginning of this process of regression, part of why something like Brecht is visible to Adorno as regressed relative to something else is that there is still some of that something else floating around. So for Adorno, there was this kind of previous kind of society where you didn't have all of this regress stuff. And then the regress stuff starts to come in as the culture industry starts to take a particular form that tends to generate this regression. So the question then is, has this culture industry continued to develop in a way which makes this even harder to cross, even harder to bridge than it would have been in the middle of the 20th century? Or has it developed in ways which open up space? And there's kind of a cyclical pattern of new technology generates a perception that there might be an opening, that there might be some new kind of medium or new kind of way in which you can create that is in some ways armored against this process. And then what tends to happen is that over time we discover that this was never the case and that it was just a mistake. But it's hard to know in advance of it, apart from making this kind of argument, which seems to be too pessimistic because it seems to rule out, before even considering what is new, the potential of new mediums.
Yeah, okay, but I feel like, yes, I don't disagree, but I feel like you're leaving out the original works and the role that the artist plays in his or her own downfall. You're abdicating, you're avoiding the way in which the left, and I'm going to just like now conflate the left with artists for a moment. The left or contemporary artists do have a responsibility to be faithful to the reality principle. That doesn't mean that we can simply ignore the factors that you're mentioning, which are market forces and the industrialization of culture and the way in which audiences are produced as well as catered to, the way in which the elimination and degradation of education serves the interests of those who produce the culture. All those things are true, but when we take them into account, we also have to then take into account our own responsibility to overcome those conditions, at least in the works that we produce, at least doing as sticking to the reality principle as best we can as we create.
See, Gen Xers have the concept of the sellout because they operate in a period where that ethic, thou shalt not sell out, seems still to be reasonably compatible with reality. When moral and ethical principles seem to become too far estranged from the real material situation in which we operate, people drop those principles. The reason that the concept of the sellout has faded among millennials and Zoomers is that it no longer seems like a principle on the basis of which one could act and survive unless somebody is fabulously rich, has parent money, has a very supportive, strange family environment. Outside of that context, it seems impossible to follow that injunction now in a way that wasn't the case as recently as the 90s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and so for that reason, people who persist in trying to make real art are engaged in what seems to be a kind of heroic supererogatory task, as opposed to doing their duty to not sell out.
Yeah, okay, but I understand everything you've just said, and I do agree that it is very difficult to make a living as a sincere, committed artist who wants to avoid selling out. I mean, the thing about selling out is that is such a flat way to say it as if it's ever going to be presented to you as a clear choice. There's a what's that? There's a movie with Lady Gaga. It was a remake of a remake. It was and it was about it's like The Rising Star or something. It's a classic film actually originally, but she is a singer who gets an opportunity to make a real career for herself. She gets a lucky break, and A Star is Born. That's the name of the movie. And in that movie, there's a moment where they say, put on this lingerie and dye your hair and, and sing this song that you didn't write and we'll make you a star. And so she's like being given a clear choice to sell out or not. And I don't remember if she did or not, but the point is that's not how this actually works. It works on you inside first. It's a matter of gripping hold of your imagination, being critical of your own ideas, and expressing yourself as best you can on the basis of the reality principle, not cheating, not even for yourself. Don't take a shortcut. That's what it means to sell out, is when you can sell yourself out before you even start, I think. But so that means that it's much harder than even you're framing it, right? It's not simply a matter of whether or not, I mean, you could get a regular job in a bank or as a teacher at a high school or in a university, or just accept that you're going to not have a very comfortable middle-class life, but get a regular job and then spend your leisure time on your art and not expect it to be taken up by the culture right away or maybe at all, but still produce works that have the potential to be discovered and to become a social fact in society. No one, no one ever promised anyone a rose garden. Well, probably we did, but you're not going to get a rose garden. The life of the artist isn't, or the leftist isn't going to be confirmed by the society you're trying to change. It's unrealistic to expect that it would be. So that's what I have to say about that. And yes, if you have family money, or if you marry someone who will work in a profession that makes a lot of money, or for whatever reason, if you don't have to do that regular working class job, it will be a lot easier than if you do. But
I think the tendency is if you don't do the regular working class job, in most cases, what happens is that the work becomes too estranged from social life. Gradually over time, the artist becomes too disconnected and unable to speak to anything. But conversely, if you do the working class job, because of the way in which working class jobs have evolved and developed over time in our society, you get completely drained at the level of energy to the point at which you're not able to create anything very good anyway. You are very in touch with the experience of society because you're in social life, you're in the workforce. But by the time you get home, you are completely shot to hell. And you don't have very much capacity generally to make anything from that point forward. So you get these autodidactic workers who would like to create something but have no energy with which to make anything any good. And then on the other side of it, you get people who have protection from the labor force, but are therefore operating in a kind of different system.
Look, Kafka was a clerk. He had a regular job
in the 20th century, when it was different, when you could go, people went to, the Portlandia, Portland, where young people go to retire, where the dream of the 90s is still alive.
Yeah. I went to Portland to retire in the 90s. I arrived in 1991.
Right. So you were able to ride the long 20th century that existed in Portland, Oregon. But generally, working class jobs have become much more draining and miserable from the point of view of energy.
Look, he
not
died of
necessarily from the point of
tuberculosis.
view purely of time.
I think he was in his 40s when Kafka died of tuberculosis. He never had a family. He never felt that he had lived up to his father's expectations of what it was to be a man. If you read Letters to My Father, Kafka didn't have it easy. This guy, it wasn't like he was, felt confirmed by the world. But anyway,
Kafka also was operating in a literary culture where a much larger number of people read regularly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I know it's harder for you millennials and Zoomers than it was for Kafka. I mean, but come on, you see how crazy that sounds? So Kafka,
it sounds crazy. That's part of how they get you, right? It seems like life is much easier now. It seems like we have all this technology. It seems like there's a much more leisurely kind of pattern to life. But from a psychological and emotional standpoint, millennials are, huge percentages are mentally ill. Huge percentages are afflicted with anxiety, depression, and other kinds of psychic maladies that interfere with their capacity to create and remain in touch with reality for any length of time.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, right. And many people would say books have been written about Kafka's mental illness, but we shouldn't believe them because that is a way, I think, to try to force a standard onto Kafka that misses the significance of the sacrifice he made of his life in the service of his art.
And if he was mentally ill, it was not in the kind of way in which people are said to be mentally ill now, where they go, I'm too anxious or I'm too depressed to do something. When you're in that kind of headspace, you're not going to make anything. So whatever was going on with Kafka mentally, it was compatible with writing Metamorphoses. That's very different from some kind of mental illness that causes you to stay in bed all day, or causes you to, even when you do have time in front of your computer, to not use that time to make anything, or to only make slop that's self-referential and absorbed with your own identity.
Well, right. I would say that Kafka requested that all of his work be burned after he died, and so there was a certain kind of self-defeating attitude in him. And luckily, his friend, what was his friend's name? Anyway,
Yeah,
denied.
but if he was really self-defeating, he would have burned it before he died. He wouldn't have written it in the first place. By saying you guys can burn it, he's making sure that they will go and look at it and decide whether to burn it.
That's true. That's true, I suppose. Well, I feel like this did not go in the direction I expected it to, but in a much more personal and real direction. You forced me to confront the reality principle. Maybe I was cheating a little bit in my original presentation, objectifying the problem a bit too much in a way, and failing to recognize. One thing I definitely failed to recognize is how difficult it would be for people to see the regression between the original Mac, the Knife, and the Bobby Darin. But yeah, I mean, nonetheless, do you have some hope that if people worked together collectively to support one another on the basis of remaining true to the reality principle, that they can create work that would be entertaining and worth reading and cut through to even now?
Well, I continue to try to do things that I think are unlikely to work. And I think that a lot of the time we have to settle for doing things that we think are unlikely to work, but that we can't be sure will fail.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that sounds fine. That's good enough. And so in the end, I'll turn this into an ad for the Expansive Realist Writers Workshop, or I'm thinking about, what do you think about this instead? Instead of calling it the Expansive Realist Movement, just call it the New Realism. Has that been done before? What do you think?
It's making me think of neorealism, which is an IR theory to do with the structure of international politics causing states to go to war with each other.
Oh, that's not what I want.
It's making me think of John Mearsheimer.
Yeah, no. I want people to think of Balzac and Twain and.
Well, I'm in politics, so what comes to my mind is probably not what comes to the mind of other people. So it might still be a good name, even though it makes me think of structural realism.
Right. Okay. Well, listen, I wanted to run this clip of Mac the Knife, a little excerpt from Peggy Lee's version of Mac the Knife, to show that. To show the regression in one more way. So here's this.
And Louis Miller disappeared, dear, after drawing out his cash. And McHeath spends like a sailor. Did our boy do something rash?
All right. That was I'm sure that this video is going to get hit by a number of copyright violations, but I'm going to say fair use to them all. We were definitely critiquing the works.
They might not do it, and if they might not, then it's worth floating it. Who knows? Maybe it will do well. That's how I create a lot of the time. I go, well, who knows? Maybe it'll do better than I think it will do.
All right. So listen, people who are watching, it seems like a number of people are watching this stream. That's good. We're going to be over at 10:20. We're going to be on the Patreon. Actually, there's a link to the Zoom call. So if you want to come and participate in a conversation about the reality principle, about millennials and Zoomers as compared to Kafka, come and please do join us. I would hope to see you there. And we'll be there in about 20 minutes. So I'll hit the outro button, which is the same as the intro, and see you next week.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential